Welcome to Vector's PREEvision version 9 tutorial series. In this installment, we will go through an introduction to the requirements management layer. So in our agenda, this will be broken down into four main parts. Just an overview of integrated requirements management and engineering within PREEvision, requirements management use cases, managing requirements, and then dependencies, mapping, and linking. So I'd like to start with just a list of features and benefits of the integrated requirements management capability as it's been implemented in PREEvision. First is that what we're doing is we're actually modeling requirements as opposed to simply recording them in a word processor. And we'll see as we go through the rest of these features and benefits how that is relevant through the rest of the model. So we have the possibility to map a requirement to any EE model artifact, which supports traceability and verification that you've actually met all your requirements through the rest of the design. We're supporting the top-down, bottom-up, or middle-out approaches. So if you're choosing to start with a set of defined devices that have perhaps been done as a part of a research project, let's say, and then you want to derive the requirements from those devices so that it can be treated in a more production-like manner, the bottom-up approach is still supported. Middle-out would be a combination of pure requirements that have no implementation plus some requirements derived from existing devices. So whether you do pure top-down, bottom-up, or middle-out, any of those approaches are completely supported within PREEvision. We have easy navigation and handling of requirements throughout all of the product line model. So you can reference things throughout the model, you can navigate to them easily and see how those mappings go through the entire chain from a requirement to a logical function to a software component to an ECU all the way down through your model. Seamless full traceability, which almost all of these things that I've been describing so far at some level relate to traceability, which is critically important. This is something that we've added recently, which is what we call a placeholder concept, which allows in your description of a requirement, it allows you to reference any attribute of any EE artifact within that description. And so particularly from a bottom-up or middle-out approach, if you have other elements in your model that you want to reference inside the description of a requirement, that placeholder allows that term or that name or whatever the attribute is that you choose to reference, it allows that to be included almost like a field inside of a word processing program, that if you were to ever change that at a later date, that change that reference, the reference inside the placeholder would update. So you would never have to go back and rewrite your requirement because you changed the name of an ECU, for instance. Our requirements capability is variant aware, which means that you can have different sets of requirements for different variants of the same product line. It supports reuse concepts so that if you intend to use the same set of requirements for more than one product, you can have those requirements used over and over and over again, and such that if you were to change one of them, they would all update. We support change history and change tracking for every attribute and relation in the requirements area. I will also point out, however, that this change history capability is only available when you're using the collaborative platform. So if you're using a file-based version of your model, the change history isn't available. And we also have version and lifecycle management. So you can define a lifecycle for a requirement, and we'll see this later in the rest of the presentation. But a requirement can move through all of the steps that you define in a life cycle, from new to reviewed to verified, or whatever it is that you decide are the relevant steps in your requirement lifecycle management. So in short, integrated requirements management is the seamless integration of requirements into the entire EE development process. Okay, so now let's talk about some typical requirements management use cases. And these are the typical use cases that we'll talk about for the rest of this presentation. This isn't all of them, but these are the ones that I think almost anyone who's going to be doing requirements inside PREEvision will run into. First is create and write requirements, relatively obvious. Managing requirements, creating and managing dependencies, and exchanging requirements. And in addition to those use cases, we've got these other areas that are now very, very relevant to almost anyone who's going to be doing requirements inside PREEvision. So we've got functional safety, test and test data management, and collaboration. Now, I'm not going to cover anything about these areas because they're basically their own topics. But suffice it to say that the requirements area inside PREEvision is very well connected into all of these additional use cases that are supportive of the entire EE development process. So one thing that we should probably cover before going any further is that if you look at the product goals layer inside PREEvision, there's a distinction between customer features and requirements. The way to think of those is that customer features describe something that the customer perceives of the product, and it's documented at a high level, not described in a very low-level technical manner. And so the intention is that that's captured relatively quickly and allows you to then, in the requirements area, refine a customer feature into an implementable lower-level specification. So you can see in this diagram that there's kind of a way to think about how customer features relate to requirements, and that the mappings between customer features typically will go to something in a logical function architecture layer because, again, it's abstract and higher level, whereas requirements tend to be mapped to artifacts in the hardware architecture or some other lower level part of the data model. So for creating requirements, they can be created via a context menu just simply by right-clicking and then saying a new and then requirement of various types here. So that can be done directly in the model tree. It could be done by direct editing in a requirements table, which I'll show once we're done with the presentation part. I'll start PREEvision and we can go through these methods. Or you can also do this by starting from any model artifact. So if you were working on, let's say, an ECU, and you thought, oh, there's a requirement that I haven't captured, you can just simply, again, from the context menu, right-click and say New Mapped Requirement, and then what will happen is that requirement will be placed into the requirements layer, but it will be automatically mapped to the element that you're currently working on. So for editing requirements, the user can edit the requirements in several different views. Again, directly in the table, the standalone editor, the property view, and there's also an integrated dedicated Office editor, the LibreOffice editor, that allows you to create and include tables, graphics, all sorts of advanced text formatting. So if you are intending ultimately to produce a document, there are all of the normal types of features that you would expect out of something like a word processing program. Requirement types. So the typical requirement subtype for a system spec, the ones that you would expect, are available. And they include things like a heading, which is not a requirement at all. It's just an organizational type. And a heading can either include outline numbering or not. The informational, the can, the intention, will, and requirement, all of those types are things that you can apply on a requirement by requirement basis. There's an entire section for safety and security requirements, which again I'll not get into, but it is also possible through refactoring to transform one of these types of requirements into another. So if you get done and you say, really those things that I thought were just intentions, I'd really like to require those, you can refactor those will requirements into shall requirements after the fact. We also provide use case diagrams. So the use case diagram provides a user-centric perspective on how the user will interact with the system and shows intended functionality and benefits from the user's perspective, and it also visualizes the relations and dependencies. Our use case diagrams follow the UML 2.0 spec, and the normal elements that you would expect are all available. So use case system, actors, include and extend relations, extension points and generalizations, all of the things that you would expect in a normal use case diagram. So covered very quickly some of our use cases. Now we'll talk about managing requirements. So I talked a little bit about a life cycle. So the life cycle of a requirement describes the sequence of states that a requirement has to go through in the process of development. So it could include things like states where you describe it as being a new requirement or a complete requirement, or it could be reviewed or verified. And there could be feedback loops where something, once it's been verified, can either continue on and be accepted or can be returned back to a state where it's complete but not reviewed. So this definition of the life cycle of a requirement is something that you can define based on your internal business process. So the life cycle allows you to restrict access based on roles. So for instance, you can say that a check-in for the role of a developer when the requirement is new is restricted. You're not allowed to check in if you're just a developer, but the requirement is new. And you can also verify that mandatory attributes are filled in before allowing a transition between life cycles. You can initiate actions on life cycle transitions. So for instance, you can request feedback from responsible sources after a transition into a certain state. So in this case, the state is called feedback. And so any of the responsible resources can be informed that they're requested to provide some feedback when that transition happens. Or you can also send emails automatically to inform a user when feedback is required. We also talk a lot about reuse in PREEvision, and that's a big part of the product line approach, is being able to reuse things that you've done and reuse them over and over again in a consistent manner. The benefits of reuse, I think most people are aware, reduces lead time, improves quality, reduces cost. And when you have existing artifacts being reused again without requiring the work to recreate them, it allows you to go quicker, and it also ensures consistency. You also ensure that any change that is made to the reused requirement or whatever the artifact is synchronized throughout all of the reuses without any need to go into each one of those reuses and update them. So now let's talk a little bit about dependencies, mapping, and linking. So linking requirements to other requirements. We can create requirement links very simply just by drag and drop. So you can drag a requirement, drop it on another one, and a flyout will come out and allow you to create that link. Links and mappings are represented in the requirements editing table as a separate column. And if you mouse over the links column, a tooltip will show you the detail for all the incoming and outgoing links. And when you're seeing those things, those aren't just descriptions, those are actual navigable links to those specific in or out links that you see in this flyout. So the information also that is shown for the links can be customized. The linking and traceability aspect is very, very important for ensuring that your design is complete. So when we talk about linking, what we're talking about is connecting artifacts that are within the requirements layer. When we're connecting a requirement to something that is outside the requirements area in the model, then we're talking about something that we call a map. And requirements can be mapped to data objects at any level of the data model just by drag and drop. And mappings can be displayed in columns shown in the model tree or can be used in diagrams. The important thing is that anything can be mapped to a requirement. Something that we've introduced in version 9 is something called a placeholder. Placeholder is used to create a reference to any property of a model artifact within a requirements formatted text field. So you can use a placeholder to essentially create a field inside your description that can be updated with the value of a property. Placeholders can be created simply by dragging and dropping something from the model tree into the description area and then choosing the attribute that you want to be represented in that area. And placeholders are shown in curly braces inside the description so that you can tell that the content there is actually a part of a referenced placeholder. When you click on that placeholder, that will navigate you to the referenced artifact in the model tree. So this is really powerful because if you've got a middle out or bottom up approach where you have existing artifacts in other layers of the model and you want to use those things in your description in the requirements layer, this allows you to ensure that whatever the name is that you apply or whatever the value of an attribute that you intend to apply in this requirement, it is always kept in sync. So even if someone goes and changes the name of something or changes the value of an attribute, your placeholder will always stay in sync with whatever the value of that artifact actually is. Very powerful idea. We can also visualize these dependencies in other areas. So requirements can be linked obviously to other requirements for traceability. And we can also show mapped requirements on other diagrams or other places within the model tree. So for instance, you see here we've got a logical architecture diagram where you can see the mapped requirements that have been mapped into this logical function. And all of these are displayed within that diagram and they're live. So for instance, if you were to click on this in the diagram, it would navigate you to that specific requirement in the model tree. Okay, so now let's go over into PREEvision and actually demonstrate some of the concepts that I've described in this presentation. Okay, so now we're in PREEvision, and for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll just be using the demo model that comes with your client install, so you can visualize these same things that I'll be demonstrating here. So I'm going to use this ellipsis product line, which is under the design model. So when you open the client and you look in the model tree, I'm also in the EE perspective. So if I expand the design model, I'll see several product lines that are all a part of this design model. I'm just going to use the first one, this ellipsis. And product goals is the name of the layer where we keep customer features and requirements. So you see that there's a customer feature package as well as a requirements area, both under product goals in this demo model. So if I expand product features, you can see that I've got something called a feature list, and underneath I've got several different features. And I think the names of these are all going to be very common amongst anyone who's operating inside this tool. So this is just an example, but you can see that it's covering things that are very common. So one thing that I wanted to demonstrate is that you can just simply by double clicking on one of these open up a requirement text editor that shows all of these things that you see in the model tree in a table for the purposes of editing. There are a lot of tricks and a lot of things that you can do to change how this is visualized, and I'll just show you one. So for instance, you can see that the headings are all listed in the requirements text editor, and even though underneath there are also things shown in the model tree, this brake-by-wire, steer-by-wire drivetrain, what's configured in this column is just the description. So when we look at this brake-by-wire, you can see that the name of that object is brake-by-wire, and this description is this is text. So we see the text because that's what's configured to show in the column. That's relatively simple to change, and this is just one example of a lot of things that you can do. So if you right-click anywhere in the column that you want to redefine the configuration of and select Table, Configure Column Text. Now the name of the column in this description or in this visualization is text. So we're going to configure that column. So we have a lot of choices about how things are displayed, and you can see that there are different colors set up right now. If the requirement is a heading, if it's just a requirement, if it's information, if it's a definition, if it's an intention, each one of those is going to show up in a different color, and you can set that color. Now these constraints that you see here are actual model queries that are built into the tool. So let's just leave this for the moment and let's go to the actual content of the text column. You see here that if we have a constraint called isHeading, then we're going to give the ID and the name. And if it's isText, then we're just going to give the description. But let's say what I really want is I want to show the name, which in this case would be brake-by-wire, and I want to show the text, which in this case is this is text. That's very simple to change. I can just click in this area, and then using these curly braces, I can say name, and then I could, put a dash in or whatever else I felt like doing. But these artifact names and types and so on can all be referenced so that now when I update this table, you can see that I've got not just the name of the feature, I've also got the description. So this is just one example of a lot of different customizations that you can do for your tables to have it show up exactly the way you like. Okay, so now that we've added this customized view of the column, let's add a new customer feature. Now there's a lot of different ways we can do this. I can simply, on the model tree, I can right click where I want this new customer feature to go, and then I can say new customer feature on the same level. So it'll add one right there, but notice that it also appears in the table. So I can change the content of that. And so when I've just double clicked in this area, what I'm actually doing is editing the description. So because we added this customization where not only the name but the description appear in this cell, I can't at this moment edit the customer feature name, but I can certainly edit, because I double clicked, the content of the description. So let's just say this is start stop. That's going to be our new customer feature. And in this area I can change the name so that I've changed this name and description at the same time. You can also add a new customer feature right within the table. So when you've selected in the table where you want the new one to go under, you can say new requirement customer feature as a child with this little flyout menu here. Or you can do new customer feature requirement on the same level, which is what I would prefer. So again, it does the exact same thing, and you'll see it both in the model tree as well as in the table itself. So this time I'm going to edit in the property view, and I'm going to say that this new powertrain feature, I will call it eco mode. Okay. So now that customer feature is in the table. I've edited it in the property view, and it also is appearing in our model tree. Okay, so let's say that now I have a set of features, but what I'd really like to do is create another set of features, and I'm going to just call this, instead of feature list, I'm going to call it, let's call it user interface or something along those lines. So I'm going to create a new package to keep those in their own little folder area. So I can do that by selecting the parent directory and saying new customer feature package. And so now I've got a brand new one here, and I'll change the name down in the property view to user interface. And let's say under this feature list, I've got multimedia already, but I'd like that to be put into this user interface area because it's going to expand. So I can just pick that up and move it. And I've got my little yellow flyout here. And when I say move, it will change and update the numbering in both areas so that now I've got the multimedia section that used to be under feature list now under user interface. So you can create packages, you can create the structure any way you like, you can move things to different sections. It's very simple to organize this in the way that you want. Okay, let's talk a little bit about linking. If you remember from the presentation, linking is when we have artifacts within the same layer, in this case the requirements layer, being connected and such that the traceability between them is maintained. I'm not going to worry too much about whether it makes sense what I'm linking together in this instance. It's just for the purposes of showing you the mechanics of how to do the linking. Typically, I prefer to just do this by drag and drop. So let's say that I want to link this central locking to the body sound requirement. I can just pick it up and move it, and then this little yellow flyout again comes out, and I can say create an incoming product goal link. So now those artifacts are linked, and if I look at the central locking in the table, I can see that I've now got an incoming link. And if I hover over that link column, it will show me what the link is, and then I can also navigate directly to it in the model tree. Another method that I can use to create a link is to just use the context menu. So I can right click on the object that I want to create a link to, and then just say new product goal link. Now what I'm going to get is a dialog that allows me to choose the type of artifact that I would like to create the link to. Now I'm going to choose requirement, and so it'll show me in this area every type of requirement that is in the rest of my design model. So you can see that I've got a lot of different things named with a section 1 here. So this is going to give me everything that was in my model tree. So you have to be a little bit careful about what you choose to make sure that it's the right one. But let's just say that I want to create a link into this area, and let's see, keyless entry and locking. That seems like it's a reasonable place to do a link. And when you try to make a link to something that isn't valid, you see here that this invalid selection will pop up, because what I was trying to, if I had chosen this one, I would be trying to create a link to a requirement package. And what I said I wanted to link to was a shall requirement. So if I choose the keyless entry, this shall requirement, then that's valid. So I'll say OK. And now again, I see that my keyless entry now has a link. And you can see that also in the model tree. And just like before, now I'm showing an outgoing link to keyless entry. Now that we've created some links in the requirements layer, let's say that later on in the development, we've got some logical architecture artifacts, right? So we've got some things that have been defined in another layer. And what we would like to do now is map some of our customer features onto the logical architecture elements that actually implement those features. Okay, so I think I'll create a mapping between the customer feature eco mode that we created before and the logical function eco mode that apparently was created at some point. So again, just like I did before when I created a link, creating a mapping can also be done by doing a drag and drop operation. And I can create the mapping, and it's going to ask me what kind of mapping do I want to create. A customer feature to logical architecture mapping is what I want to create. So I'll just say OK. So now this eco mode customer feature now shows a customer feature mapping, and the source is our requirement, and the target is the eco mode function. Now that we have the mapping created, let's show how that can be visualized on a logical architecture diagram. So let's open this architecture diagram here. And if I select the logical function where the mapping was created, and I right-click for the context menu, I can say show hide mappings, or I can also just choose Control M. It'll do the same thing, and it'll give me the choice of which I actually want to show. In our case, we've only got one, so I check the box, and then I can show it as an internal box or as an external box. Let's choose external box. So now on this logical architecture diagram, I've got a visualization of the mapping back to the requirement that I linked before. So when you're looking at this diagram, now you can see what led to the creation of this logical function. Now let's show an example of using a placeholder to insert content into the description that is a reference to other parts of the model. So I've just chosen this requirement. It happens to be in the requirements area, not the customer features area, but it operates the same way. Let's say that I want to insert into the text of the description of this body sound requirement the name of the ECU that I'm actually directing this requirement to. Let's say it's the sliding door module, which I know that there is one. There's a sliding door controller right here in the model tree. So I'm going to do this via drag and drop, and because as soon as I select this sliding door controller, it's going to attempt to show me the property page for that same thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pin the navigation. This little icon here allows me to pin that property page so that even when I select something else, it will leave the property page that I currently have. So I'm going to then select and activate the editing for the description. And let's say I'm going to put in some text. And I'm going to leave the space for the sliding door controller name. Shall ensure that the sound is quiet. Not a very good requirement, but that's just an example. So now I can come over into the model tree and grab the sliding door controller, bring it over here and drop it into that section. And when I drop it, even though it's showing me the whole object, what I now get is a dialog that allows me to choose any of the artifact properties, right? It's anything. Any of the information about that artifact is completely in scope to include inside my requirement. So I'm just going to change the name or add the name. Now you see that what happened was the sliding door controller is the name of that artifact. Now notice that I'm still on the body sound requirement in the model tree. If I activate the description and then click into this area, it'll navigate to the section where this reference or this placeholder actually came from. So I can use this as a simple and quick way to get to where I've created those placeholders. I think that's all I have time to cover in this iteration of the requirements layer. I think I will have to choose some other features and capabilities to demonstrate in another video. But this is just the beginning. There's a lot of other capabilities, and I think you can see that this is a very powerful layer within PREEvision. Thanks for watching, and for more information about Vector and our products, please visit vector.com.